So Voices from Oxford today is in the famous round room of the Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford University. And I'm joined by three other scientists, Gijsbert, Matthew, Tianyi, and myself, Denis, to talk about a major issue, which is what is science actually for? Why do we do it, and why should the public fund it? What are the issues in the funding of science, and what other problems arise because science now becomes an area where large amounts of money are spent? So just to begin this discussion, you and I, Matthew, remember this kind of discussion from a long time ago.
30 years ago, I think.
That's right, because we formed a campaigning organisation. But in the interim, and looking at the situation today, would you see the problems being very different, much the same? And what are the key problems?
Well, sadly, I think they're repeating themselves a bit. Although I would say that the work that was done by us and by other organisations then did move everything on a bit. So, originally the problem we had was that we were dealing with a government that actually didn't believe there was any need to fund science at all.
Not publicly.
Not publicly,
it was all
sorry.
To be private.
Precisely.
Yes,
so,
right.
so there was no requirement, and indeed there was a famous point where Keith Joseph, the government minister, said that he compared science to opera as something that you would fund as a luxury if you were a sort of rich society, and at the time we were not, and therefore there was no argument for public funding of science. I think that argument has actually now largely disappeared.
I think so
and
too, yes.
I don't think we can complain. I don't think we can claim complete credit for it. But what we did then contributed to that.
Contributed very strongly to that, didn't it?
It did.
Now, that raises the question. Suppose it had gone 30 years ago that government funding had gone completely, because that was the idea. We would have had private funding, presumably therefore from just private charities and industry. Would either of you, Gijsbert or Tianyi, been happy with that? And if not, why not? Gijsbert, how about you?
I don't think I would be quite happy with that, Denis, and particularly because even though there may be various scientific discoveries which don't have an immediate clear benefit to application to society, generally I think it is important to generate these blue sky results that we have no idea yet what are going to mean, because quite often, sometimes decades or sometimes even centuries later, they do in fact have a benefit. I mean, the classical examples, of course, special relativity, which we now need for GPS. Einstein certainly wasn't trying to develop a GPS or a navigation system at the time, so I think there's something incredibly short-sighted into only focusing on applications in a really short time period, because I think the fundamental breakthroughs are unpredictable and probably also require long-term investment and are only going to have that applied effect in perhaps decades from now. And that's where government and society as a whole, and perhaps not just government but also charity and these type of things, need to step in, because the private sector is not going to produce that type of research necessarily, and nor should they.
Yes. Tianyi, you work in a biochemistry department, which is, and you're in the area of genetics, actually epigenetics, which is a hot area now. And there must be, at least 1,000 companies that have been formed that are trying to do epigenetics in one form or another and find new drugs and so on. Would you be happy if all the funding had to be done through industry or not?
I think definitely not. I mean, I completely agree that research and development really drives economic growth, but at the same time, I do feel like the important scientific questions should be driven with science in mind, really getting down to the biology, rather than just focusing on the potential future applications, which, are important, but I agree with everyone. Yeah.
So to sum up this part of our discussion, it would be that by public funding science in a public way through government and similar organizations, it's a kind of guarantee that novelty will come out in the future, which would not necessarily be the case, if I've understood both of you correctly, would not necessarily be the case if it was driven by industry objectives. Is that reasonably clear? But having settled that, Nevertheless, there are problems, aren't there? No government can afford infinite amounts of money for science, so there's always competition for what we need to have. You must have a lot of experience of that, Matthew, because you presumably, well, first of all, you're actually a head of department. You have to allocate resources.
I live with the difficulties of
exactly.
Yes, exactly.
And you must also be serving on research committees and so on. So what do you see there as the problems, given that we've already established that there has to be public funding? What are the issues there?
Well, fundamentally, the problem is that it's impossible to predict where the great breakthroughs are coming from.
Right, isn't it? Yes.
And the closer you are to the cutting edge, the harder it is to predict what's going to turn into something important. And so I think probably the way you have to think about it is, as a government, as a society, as a funding agency, you have to have a portfolio. And you have a portfolio where at one end of it you have things where are closer to being translational and closer to application. And at the other end you have to take a punt sometimes on what's sometimes called the blue sky or the sort of fundamental end of things. And of course what the sort of irony is, it's from that fundamental end where the real breakthroughs come from. The great breakthroughs that have not only developed new products but have developed whole new economic sectors tend to come from areas you just won't ever expect them to be from. And so I think it's important that whether you're thinking at a national level or at the level of an individual funding agency, you think of it in terms of that sort of spectrum or that portfolio of research, some of it more applied and some of it more basic.
Where would you place yourself on that spectrum, Gijsbert?
I would place myself fairly far on the fundamental side. So my research is into evolution of cooperation and more generally evolutionary biology. And I think if we look at sort of the applied aspects of evolution, only now are we starting to think about things like antibiotic resistance and resistance to cancer therapy and these types of things. And certainly that was not what anybody had in mind when developing evolutionary theory or biology more generally in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Indeed. But wouldn't also the working on the evolution of cooperation has big implications for society, economics, and so on, doesn't it?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I work on cooperation in the natural world, but I think the fundamental principles are often very much the same as those in human interactions, in human societies, and I think at the very least it's very interesting to compare them. My aim with that is not to produce an immediate application, but I hope it does.
It's not too difficult to see where those applications would come from,
exactly.
Is it? No. Even in an area which, as you say, would be regarded as straight fundamental research. Now, Tianyi, again, I'm going to put you in the position of being the person who's always perhaps closer to application than anywhere else, because there must be many drug companies interested in the question of epigenetics and what leads on from that. How do you see that tension between the fundamental research and applied?
I think for me, at a personal level, my interest is definitely in the basic research, but the things that we're studying, so epigenetics has a huge role in early development, and misregulation of these systems can lead to multiple diseases. So I do agree that understanding the basic biology gives great insight into understanding these pathologies. And for instance, drugs targeting epigenetic modifiers, such as histone deacetylase inhibitors or inhibitors of certain acetyltransferase compounds have been developed, and they are being used in clinical practices.
Yes.
So,
but that's not your main focus,
no,
is it?
that's not my.
No, you see, it's almost the same story, isn't it?
It's important to.
Yes.
I agree. It's important to really understand the basic biology and know what's happening. Because right now we're using a lot of drugs because we see a desirable effect, but we actually don't know the pathways through which those drugs act, and then you can get into some situations where people are not getting optimal treatments, for instance.
And would it be correct to say, to sum up the situation, if we come back to the question of the committees that allocate money, nobody, and certainly not a chairman of such a committee, I've been chair of many committees myself, but nobody can actually see all of that in a way that would say, okay, we now direct research in this way because we know where it's going. Is that fair as a comment about how...
Absolutely, it's the point that I was making earlier, that you simply can't predict it, and so therefore you have to spread your money across a sort of range of different possibilities, in the belief that some of them will come good and some won't. I mean, science is, as we all know, science is 90% failure. And yet that's okay, because the 10% that succeeds, is important. And so you have to be prepared to put your money on 90% of things that may not succeed in order to find those 10 that do. And nobody, sadly, I mean, we'd all be much better scientists if we could predict which of the 10% of our efforts were the ones that were well spent and which 90% are not well spent, but we can't.
Is this very different, though, from what in the world of banking and investing that they have to cope with? Because they also have the situation in which they don't know which companies are going to be highly successful initially. Many of the highly successful ones today have actually started from tiny little startups in a backyard in Los Angeles. So this is a similar kind of problem, isn't it? How can you see the future? How can you know where to put all your money? And I think the point you made, Matthew, which is you have a spread, a portfolio, as we call it. Well, the banking community uses exactly the same term. Yes, so you have a portfolio, and you look for the possibility that out of those 100 things you might fund, 2 or 3 will produce absolutely fabulous results. Am I right?
Of course.
I think that's it, isn't it?
And we can't pick winners. I mean, and that's the problem, and committees can't, and sort of committees of the great and good are probably the least good people at picking such winners, because actually you want it coming from the bottom up. You want it coming from the young, active scientists, not the elderly people sitting around the table on these committees.
Which is why we've made sure there isn't just you and me, Matthew, here. There's also Tianyi and Gijsbert represent the younger minds. But let me give you an opportunity to come in on that, Gijsbert.
I recently read an interesting article which argued if you can predict an idea, it's likely to be transformative. That's perhaps a bit harsh, but it's sort of highlighting this idea that nobody can really predict it, and that's why, as a society, we should create mechanisms to generate that portfolio, including really risky options. But I think it's really important that we, as scientists, and we have a responsibility there to keep on explaining that is the way science works to the public, because we tend to perhaps overemphasize direct applications too much in some of our research and communication, public science communication. I think thereby giving too much of the suggestion that the aim of science is just that immediate application on the 2 to 5 year time period. And it is that too. I don't think that's an important effect that is key, because if we don't do that, then we never get those products. But it's also that fundamental understanding about things that we may never have any application. And that is fine too, because, as you said, once in 100 times, perhaps even less, it creates something that is really so big. Like antibiotics, it save potentially 100 million lives, that it pays for centuries and centuries of science investments. We don't invest that much in science you need a really big bang only once every century, perhaps fewer. I don't know. The success rate for the really risky stuff doesn't need to be that high. Mm.
And indeed, we happen to be in the building where antibiotics were first used. I know. Well, I'm saying it for you, Matthew, because I can be extremely complimentary to the Dunn School for having given that to the world, because you did. It was actually not actually what it was commercialized in the end, of course, because antibiotics are made everywhere. But the question of whether commercial considerations came at the beginning didn't arise because there was a war. Yep. And there was the need to save soldiers, and by goodness me, it did. But Tianyi, just to come back to you now, I'm wondering, as we begin to round up this discussion, what else you want to raise by way of issues to do with science funding and where science is going?
So I guess I'm quite interested in the idea of what you were saying, the mistrust of experts. So would you counter that by saying that we require more of a technocracy? So do you think that experts have a bigger role to play in shaping how
It's a very interesting question, Tianyi, and let's see how we can, three of us to take this up, because this is the period of time in which the role of experts is being questioned very seriously indeed. We have, I don't need to go through this, do we, but we have a president of the United States who more or less came to power through saying we don't trust the experts. Now, is that dangerous?
I mean, I think it is very dangerous, and then the world right now is incredibly polarized, and I think there's a greater need for more pluralism. And often, I think we as scientists, we tend to dismiss beliefs from certain groups of people, but I think those, and you have these alternative right demonstrations because certain groups of people feel like they're not being heard. So I do agree, like we need greater science literacy, mathematical literacy, and I don't know, I think it's just about education and discussion and avoiding this polarization that's happening right
Isn't
now.
it? Absolutely, and I think we'd all agree with that, wouldn't it? It's about education, making sure that we've got an educated public that can understand what experts are saying, exactly so, and interpret even when there's conflict between expert advice.
And there's also kind of this, people expect experts to be unbiased, and then they're kind of shocked when they're also advocating from their political, social, orientation.
That's a very interesting question. Can we be unbiased?
No. I mean, science fundamentally is not biased. There are truths, and we are searching for those truths. But we who are searching are all imperfect humans with all the same degree of biases and sort of pre-assumptions that anyone else out there has. And so the way science is done is a social construct. That doesn't mean that what we're trying to look for is a social construct. It's not. There are real truths about how nature works, but we're not very good at looking at them, and we bring all our prejudices to bear when we do it, and that then makes science, the sort of scientific enterprise, a very imperfect process. And you're right, people don't understand that. And actually, one of the important things that we all say all the time, but it gets lost in the noise, is the fact that mostly science is about what we don't know, not what we do know. And our inability to be able to say something certain about the hot issue of the day is one of the great problems, because if you ask a scientist whether X causes Y, they will say, well, it's complicated, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. If you ask a politician about that, they will say, absolutely categorically yes or no as it suits them, and that's a difficult debate to have then. But I think we just have to keep, educating people about the science, but in a way, more importantly, I think, educating people about the scientific method and about the understanding of uncertainty and the understanding that there are things we know and there are things we don't yet know. And where we don't yet know about them, we can speculate, but our speculation may not be much better than anyone else's.
Let me put a question to you, Gijsbert, because I spend a fair amount of time in the year working in the United States, in a part of the United States where I find that almost every other person I meet and talk to thinks the world was formed 6,000 years ago. Now, how do you deal with that? Because let me just say one thing further before I ask you to elaborate, because this is a very good example, isn't it, where expert opinion says one thing and a lot of other people will be very doubtful. But just simply telling them they're plain wrong doesn't work, does it? That's the curious thing.
No, it doesn't. No, and I think this is one of the areas where science immediately impacts upon very fundamentally held beliefs of people, and where, to some extent, believing in those scientific facts, because the world wasn't in fact founded 6 years ago, has become almost a signal of a political or tribal allegiance.
Whether you're in one camp or another.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, the same thing has happened, I think, with climate change type research, and there because the implications of if climate change were real, which we think it is in the scientific community at least, may have political implications, which believes people hold very dearly about free markets and those type of things. But I think we should, as scientists, recognize in order to avoid becoming an actor in that political or cultural battle as much as possible. And I think that's really important that we avoid that at all costs, because if we are perceived as a political actor, they say that because they are part of the establishment or whatever group that's achieving a political aim X, Y, Z. then obviously in the minds of the population that is going to affect our impartiality. So I always try to separate very clearly. I am a person. I have political views. I think we should do various things and improve society in various ways, but these are derived from me as a citizen of this country or of whatever country. And then I have a scientific expertise that can tell you, in my case, for instance, if we build this factory here, this local butterfly population may go extinct. But then whether or not that is worth it compared to the additional jobs and economic growth or whatever, that is a political judgment call to make. And I can only say, if we build that factory, the butterfly population is 80% likely to go extinct. That's a real shame because there's none anymore. Then whether or not that's a good idea, I have no opinions of as a scientist. I have very many opinions of that as a person and as an individual. I think it is really difficult to separate these things. But what I try to do whenever I participate in the public debate, and I think as scientist I try to participate in the public debate at the level of expertise, and then as a citizen, which I am also at the same time, I may or may not have an opinion about whether or not we should build that factory.
So, Gijsbert, you've raised a very important general issue, which is, I think, best put in terms of the balance, is it, between the expert saying, I know, and on the other hand, saying, well, we don't know everything. So that balance, and the balance between what one knows as one's expertise and what one knows because one has personal opinions about things. And that balance, I think, you put extremely well. And I want, therefore, to see how Matthew regards those particular balances between the expert who can say sometimes, well, I can tell you for certain that this is happening, but sometimes it's quite important to qualify that and say, but it's not quite so simple. And that balance is one issue, and the other, of course, is the balance between one's personal viewpoint and what we think the science is showing. How do you see that? Then I'll come on to
Tianyi. To be honest, I couldn't have put it more clearly myself. I mean, I think that's exactly right. We operate at different levels. We operate as citizens and we operate as scientists. And as scientists, we're experts, and I suspect the four of us would all agree that expertise is required. Sadly, that isn't universally agreed these days, but I don't think any of us would disagree with that. But I think what is clear that we also operate as citizens, and as citizens we don't have a greater voice than anyone else does. And what you have to do with any of these decisions, exactly as you were saying, is you have to sort of split out that part of the discussion which is based on your scientific expertise, where you have something additional to add, and that part of the discussion which is you're putting forward your own biases, your own political beliefs, your own social beliefs. Yes. And I think it's as clear as that. I think what's difficult is that we're living in a world now, not just in the US, but also in the UK, where expertise itself, per se, has been challenged. Yes, and that is an incredibly, frankly, it's kind of weird, and it's also dangerous.
Indeed. Now, you've had experience of North America, actually Canada, Tianyi. How do you see this balance issue?
So if I can just backtrack a bit,
Do, please,
I would like to actually challenge the definition of expert. Right. So I do agree that we have accumulated a lot of knowledge in our area of expertise, but actually, having worked as an intern in the Government of Canada and Health Canada in particular, I've had some experience trying to transfer that knowledge into regulation, and that's when I think it can get very tricky. So in 1999, Canada passed a Canadian Environmental Protection Act, where we wanted to be able to say that chemicals that were going into the environment over long-term periods, how were they going to affect the wildlife and things like that. And then, so we knew that these things had to be tested and they had to be regulated. So as part of this group, I was trying to just collect data on, for things like cosmetic compounds or natural products. Should they be regulated? How should they be regulated? And what percentage of this compound in the water would present as being dangerous over a long term? And you look at the studies and you find that most studies are on acute effects on frog development or whatever development. But really trying to take your expertise and translate it so that you can give numbers, to industry is incredibly difficult. So I think I can completely understand that while the public may recognize that we have knowledge, I think they want to know, how can we actually inform policymakers and translate that into something that's, more usable for them.
But that's not challenging the idea of expertise. What that's challenging is the idea that experts always have the right information. You'd rather have an expert trying to work out that difficult problem about what the concentration acceptable is than someone who knows nothing about it at all. But I think the point you're making is that a lot of what gets published and put in the literature is not directly applicable to a real world situation, and therefore there needs to be some sort of translation from what's in the scientific literature to social policy or environmental policy or whatever. Is that right? Is that what you're...
Extent, yes, but at the same time, you often find criticisms that say, experts can't even agree about, what the data is or how to interpret it. So, and, as scientists, we can totally understand that because, science is about debate and challenging existing, hypotheses and theories. But when you take that to the political environment, that becomes very difficult.
It does.
And you're really returning, therefore, to the point you were making earlier on, which is the answer has to be a more educated public, doesn't it? Because the dilemma you were pointing out earlier on, Matthew, which is that in the end, it's after all going to be opinion generally, which will be expressed through the electorate, electing particular people to be this, that, or the other, presidents or prime minister, whatever, that influence the direction in which our politics goes. But if that's not well informed in terms of what science has managed to show, and also well informed in terms of the fact that there's judgment here to be made, not just certainty, but judgment about various factors that have to be taken into account, those are really huge issues, aren't they? And I think that's best left for another discussion sometimes by Voices from Oxford. But meanwhile, thank you all, Tianyi, Gijsbert, Matthew, for joining me, Denis Noble, on Voices from Oxford to discuss the funding of science and the problems that it creates. Thank you very much.